Very much, Stephen. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. A couple of notes at the outset here. I think we mentioned this often, but it's something very much worth checking out is our Dole Institute blog. That's doleinstituteblog.org, and we're always soliciting comments and participation in the blog. Secondly, is there will be a book signing of Monkey Girl immediately after tonight's program. The books can be purchased out in the lobby, and we would encourage all of you to buy at least 5 each. It's an outstanding book, and you're going to really enjoy tonight's presentation. Third and finally, question and answers. We have just 2 rules on questions and answers. The first is if you want to ask a question, that's great. Please raise your hand and wait for one of our students with microphones to bring the microphone to you. And then secondly, ask one question. No speeches allowed. Last May, I received an email from a fellow I had never heard of or met. His name was Ed Humes, and he asked me how he could get in touch with Bob Dole about a book he had just written called Over Here on the GI Bill. As soon as I heard this, I sent him the information that he wanted about reaching out to Bob Dole, but I also said, this is the kind of topic we're really interested in here at the Dole Institute. How about coming out here to talk? And he agreed to do it. And he was a terrific guest, and he was just here right before Veterans Day last fall. Now, Ed told us at the time that he had just completed a book on the evolution, intelligent design, public debate in Pennsylvania, and the court case surrounding that fight. I commented to him, first of all, that he was a very prolific author, that he was speaking in the fall on one topic and publishing another book on a totally different topic in the spring. But I said, hey, that's a very important topic, especially in Kansas. How would you like to come back and talk about that? And he agreed. Now, Monkey Girl is an incredible book. The Washington Post reviewer wrote about Monkey Girl, quote, as Edward Humes describes in this lively and thoughtful book, Dover, Pennsylvania, like Dayton, Tennessee during the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, became a proving ground for clashing beliefs about the origins of life and constitutional questions about the separation of church and state. Hume's book is a compelling account of that struggle and likely not the last salvo in the battle between evolution and intelligent design. As I said, this is a very important issue, and Ed has written a book that accurately portrays both sides of this fight. Ed Humes has written a number of other books as well as magazine and newspaper articles. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He defines his craft this way, quote, in my books I try to take readers inside worlds most don't get to visit or see up close on their own. Please welcome back to the Dole Institute of Politics and the University of Kansas, Edward Humes. Ed?
Bill always gives such a great introduction. I have to make sure I send you some of that barbecue that you sent me last time. That was the best part about coming here, or one of the best, was getting the barbecue in the mail when I got home. Oh, okay. Well, is this a tradition? I wasn't sure if I was just particularly lucky, but there's some real Kansas barbecue showed up on my doorstep a couple of months after I was here, and it was it was a big fight in the house over who was going to get to eat it. My kids won, but that's what happens. I should point out that Charles Darwin's 198th birthday was last month, and in honor of that, it's worth noting that even after so many years, there is a cultural disconnect in our society that is, if you'll pardon the expression, one of biblical proportions. On the one hand is the scientific community, which is pretty much nearly unanimous in its embrace of the theory of evolution as a well-tested, well-supported, evidence-rich, and important explanation for the diversity of life on Earth, including the development of human beings. Darwin's so-called dangerous idea, as it's been called. And on the other side is the majority of Americans who are not scientists with expertise in biology or related disciplines. Nearly 2/3 of Americans, according to polling on this question, either doubt or reject outright the theory of evolution. And by implication, consider the scientists who say otherwise to be liars. So think about that for a second. Everyone has an opinion on this subject, I tend to find, one way or another, informed or otherwise. But if you can, resist the tendency that some have to look at the other side as a bunch of, godless academics or uninformed Bible thumpers or whatever characterization gets bandied about here, because this disconnect is really quite profound and profoundly worrisome. It reveals a broader cultural conflict between faith and science that has a lot of potential consequences for our Constitution, for our economy, for our educational system, even our ability to compete in the global marketplace. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. It's fascinating to me. Why would a country that so loves its state-of-the-art medical technology, its laser-driven DVD players, its digital lifestyle, all the fruits of science, and yet simultaneously reject an idea, a scientific theory that's overwhelmingly supported by the scientific community? Why this disconnect? It's the question that is in part behind my desire to write Monkey Girl and to explore these questions. And this is really just the latest chapter in America's long war over what we should teach our children and what we believe about where we come from. And when you start looking at that question, it's also a question about where we're going as a people, as a culture, as a country. Now, I came to believe that the case that's at the heart of Monkey Girl that Bill mentioned to you, the Kitzmiller versus Dover case that unfolded, the intelligent design trial, as was also called, really provides some insights, some possible answers to why this disconnect exists, and maybe it even hints at some ways of starting to close that rift that's in our society. It quite probably is the most dramatic confrontation between science and religious or other alternatives to evolutionary theory since the Scopes monkey trial, since the day when Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan faced off in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. A case that actually is known better through its dramatized and fictionalized version, Inherit the Wind, than it is to the actual record of the case, which turned out to have pretty much no effect on the law as it existed for teaching evolution and its alternatives at the time, popular perceptions aside. The trial in Pennsylvania, however, had held out the possibility of having a dramatic effect on what we teach our children and how we approach the subject of evolution, because the agenda of the school board in Dover that initiated this conflict was to see this case through all the way to the Supreme Court and to try to make some new law on this subject. Now, the case ended in Pennsylvania without that happening, but it will most certainly not be the last time this issue ends up in the headlines and in the courts. As I wrote in Monkey Girl, this story never really ends, it evolves. Now, as most of you know, the Kitzmiller trial in Pennsylvania had a parallel here in Kansas, similar, although distinct in some important ways. These were the hearings in Topeka some time ago on proposed science standards for the public schools that were convened by the State Board of Education. And I talk about this in Monkey Girl as well as a kind of almost prelude to the trial in Dover. Now, the two events, wow, does this sound okay? I'm getting a weird echo up here. Everybody hear me okay? Yes? There were two important differences between the two evolution dramas. In Kansas, the judges, so to speak, in the case, were school board members who I came to understand were looking less for answers through the hearings that they initiated, but a kind of ratification for a decision they had already made, which boiled down to its core as a kind of redefinition of what science is, a redefinition that would have allowed, among other things, a supernatural explanation for natural phenomena. Now this represents a kind of a rollback of a principle that has held sway since the Great Enlightenment, since the days of Isaac Newton, of an approach that has really been key to the modern scientific method, which is to attempt to limit scientific explanations to natural explanations for nature. It's a conscious limiting of science. And I use the word limited here and stress it because that's really what it's about. It's about constricting science to make it smaller than the larger universe of explanations that religion and philosophy attempt to formulate. The analogy I like to draw for this is if you stop thinking, as most of us have, that lightning is a manifestation of divine anger and start to examine it as a potentially natural phenomena, it becomes possible to invent things like lightning rods. Now, you wouldn't put a lightning rod on your roof to protect yourself from God's wrath, but you might do so if you wanted to protect yourself from an electromagnetic phenomenon. And that's literally how that particular invention came to being, through a limitation on the kinds of explanations science is willing to offer. So the Kansas school board's proposed standards, using seemingly simple and reasonable language, really had a very radical potential effect to erase this limitation on science. And for that reason, the hearings in Kansas ended up being a disappointment because the mainstream scientific community stayed away. They didn't participate. And so the resulting testimony was one-sided and not terribly enlightening. A mere warm-up for the main story I ended up focusing on in Monkey Girl, which was the Kitzmiller case in Pennsylvania. Now, in that case, both sides did participate, and vigorously. And I think one of the main stars of the show, if you could call it that, was science. Some of it quite riveting and often quite beautiful. And another important difference from how things played out here in Kansas, the judge in the Kitzmiller case, despite what some critics have claimed, had no apparent axe to grind at the outset when it came to answering that most basic question: what should we teach our children about where we come from? Okay? One journalist who was present at the trial characterized it as the science class you always wished you could have had in high school, or maybe it was college. And there was something to that. At times, I must admit, it was a bit mind-numbing, or sleep-inducing, as the case may be. But much of it was utterly fascinating. There was spectacular fossils displayed in one slideshow presentation of a creature who's known colloquially as the walking whale. It's a whale-like creature with legs, a fossil from many millions of years ago. There were fossil images of feathered dinosaurs, and they looked like works of art. They were quite remarkable, preserved in shale, almost like a lithograph. Very finely detailed fossils. I had never seen anything quite like it. There were creatures that seemed to display qualities of both mammal and reptile. And there was a reason this presentation was being made. It was to answer what is one of the many common criticisms of evolutionary theory from those who would criticize it. That is, that there is no evidence of transitions between the different species and the different kinds of animals. And here was this paleontologist, Kevin Padian, from the University of California at Berkeley, where he runs a museum. He says, I got a museum full of transitional fossils, and here's the slides to prove it. You know, he calls these fossils, these ancient creatures, his critters, and he's a very engaging guy. But the bottom line of his testimony was, there's this popular idea that there's these missing links in here, but they're not missing. We find them all the time. And if you talk to evolutionary biologists, they'll tell you, this whole idea of transitional species is not even accurate. Everything's a transitional species because evolution never stops except when things become extinct. life is always changing. It's always evolving. It just happens very slowly. So the scientific information was almost overwhelming. There was evidence that was introduced from the human genome, a graphic representation of the similarities between different but related forms of life on Earth. And what was fascinating is that DNA evidence, which is so new and was unknown in the time of Darwin, had the power to, if it didn't show the kinds of linkages that Darwin's theory of evolution predicted, it would overthrow evolution as a theory. And intelligent design, the alternative, would get a big boost. But this DNA of information that was not even envisioned in the days of Darwin didn't disprove evolution. It supported it. It posed a test that the theory passed. That was the argument that was presented on the side of evolution. And this was presented in behalf of parents who sued the school district in Dover because they argued their religious rights were being violated because the school was presenting intelligent design in the classrooms, and that the parents maintained was not science but religious in nature, and therefore inappropriate for a public school. The part of the case was showing that the science of evolution was valid and appropriate for public schools, but that intelligent design was not. The testimony about the science ended up being so compelling that after the case was over, I had a chance to talk with Judge John E. Jones III, who was the federal judge who presided over this trial. And he said, I have one regret, and that's that I said no to court TV. And he confessed, he said, all I could think about when they asked, and federal judges, almost reflexively, as far as I know, always say no to TV cameras in the courtroom. Judge Jones says, well, all I could think about was Judge Ito, the judge from the O.J. Simpson case, whose career never recovered from his decision to say yes to court TV. And but he came to believe that had he allowed the cameras, at least for portions of the testimony, and given a greater audience the opportunity to see the evidence he saw, and this wonderful and frequently beautiful scientific imagery, that it would have a positive effect on this conflict, that perhaps the area of disagreement would begin to grow smaller. Only it were that easy. If my work on this book has led me to conclude anything, it's that this modern conflict between science and faith has all the attributes of some sort of super resistant bacteria. It will not easily be put to rest. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And maybe the TV cameras would have been a good idea. I don't know. But the answer isn't that simple. This conflict between belief and science, between faith and evolution, is what drove many of the memorable characters I encountered while working on this book. Certainly the school board members who came to loathe the idea of evolutionary theory being taught. They were fretting literally for the souls of their children. They felt, our beliefs are being undermined by by what's being taught in science, and we need to balance it out. And I do believe that they thought that they were doing something that was a positive for their community and would be good for their children. And just as well-intended and just as driven by this conflict were the science teachers in Dover, Pennsylvania, who risked their jobs, who put their careers on the line by saying, what, whatever you tell us, we're not going to teach this because it would be teaching a lie. We don't believe intelligent design is science, and here's why. And they tried to explain it to the board, but there was no meaningful communication between the two positions by that point. The community had become polarized. In the end, the presentation about intelligent design that was presented in the Dover schools had to be presented by the administrators in the school district, who went classroom to classroom, made their little talk, while the teachers stood out in the halls like the bad kids, along with the kids who risked being stigmatized by opting out of the presentation. And that's where the where the title of my book, Monkey Girl, comes from the insults that were hurled about on the schoolyard and also in the school board meeting rooms about, who in your family is the monkey. Insults aimed at the what was then the minority of people who were championing the idea of evolution over intelligent design in this community. One of the interesting things about this, as an aside, and that shows you just how polarizing and difficult this conflict can be to deal with, is that during the presentation on intelligent design, the administrators of the district instructed the students not to ask questions. You can hear this information, but you may not ask questions about it. Can you imagine a school telling a student not to question? It's exactly the opposite of where we need to be in our schools. And that's what this conflict did to the Dover schools. Now, pursuing this story took me to some amazing places, and part of the tale emerged, for me, in a mega church in San Juan Capistrano, California, not too far from President Nixon's old Western White House in San Clemente. It's a very affluent area. Education and income levels are quite high. And this particular church was having a huge event on intelligent design and creation and a critique of evolution. So, and there was a particular speaker there who played an ancillary role in the Dover case. So I went, and it was an eye-opener for me because I had not been to one of these events before. Now, the speakers at this event, as well as the congregation of this church, have some very literal biblical beliefs. They believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. One of the things they talked about was how geologists were wrong about physical features of the earth like the Grand Canyon. They were not formed over millions of years of geological processes, but were formed through during a single cataclysm, the Great Flood of Noah's Ark fame. Outside the congregation hall, there's scale models of dinosaurs boarding the Ark, Noah's Ark, on view outside the main auditorium. And there was a lecture explaining how that worked, because for the age of the Earth to be what these speakers asserted it was necessary for dinosaurs and human beings to have lived at the same time on Earth, which is contradictory to what the mainstream scientific view is. Now, there was one particular lecturer, the one I went there to see, who goes by the name of Dr. Dino, and he had 3,000 worshipers in this great meeting place, just an amazing venue, cheering like Super Bowl fans. And he attracts audiences on a routine basis that's very few authors, I can tell you, can match. And so really it's no laughing matter when I tell you how he dismissed evolution, paleontology, and geology as evil hogwash with this enticing image. And I want to get the quote just right. "If I got buried on top of a hamster, does that prove he's my grandpa?" I said no laughing matter. No. This was the legendary Dr. Dino, is his nom de, well, not his nom de plume, but it's his stage name. His real name is Kent Hovind, and kind of in all his glory before his unfortunate fall. He's now doing 10 years in prison for tax evasion, for claiming the income from those impressive 200-page speaking gigs a year belonged to God, and therefore was not subject to taxation. So Dr. Dino's audiences are somewhat smaller now. But the folks at the mega church, now his case was pending when I saw him there, and the folks at the church were well aware of the controversy around him. And it was interesting because when I talked to him, I said, well, we're not paying attention to that. It's just another conspiracy by those scientists and Darwinists to silence a truth teller. And that was really the pervasive impression, that this guy's just trying to tell the truth, but going up against the scientific establishment. And we all know how powerful those scientists are. and he was the victim of a conspiracy. Now, this is a place where really Charles Darwin's name is uttered like a curse. You know, he's right up there with Hitler, Stalin, Marx, and Judas, and then there's Darwin. And suffice it to say, there was strong support in this community for what this school district in Dover was doing, teaching alternatives to evolution, expressing distrust of science, or actually the term that was preferred there was materialism, which certainly has some freighted meanings, science and materialism, as opposed to, I guess, a more spiritual approach to looking at the natural world. So that was my visit with Dr. Dino and the Mega Church and Intelligent Design presentation. And the story next, for me, took me to, I like to call it the hidden oceans of Kansas. And I'm sure most of you probably know that geologists tell us that Kansas was the floor of a vast, shallow ocean that divided the continent before it was really North America. Today, deep beneath the surface of the sandy soil there are fossilized bones of prehistoric sea monsters, you could call them. Evidence of a very ancient and very different environment here in Kansas. And I found it fascinating that this would be such fertile ground in the previous century, or even 2 centuries ago, for the great bone hunters who were searching for fossils, documenting an ancient and distant past. And yet the science standards that were being bandied about by the Board of Education would lead to a policy that would permit schools and teachers to challenge pretty much everything we know about those fossils, their age, how they came to be. Fossils that actually predate the dinosaurs, or most of them. Fascinating paleontological past of Kansas. As I recall, and I mentioned this in the book, there was an earlier controversy about teaching origins. I believe began in 1999 in Kansas, and a textbook was about to come out that was to be adopted by the schools, and there was a long chapter on the chalk formations in Kansas's geology, and the ancient sea and the fossils that were found there. After some new guidelines were adopted, or new standards were adopted by the school board, the textbook publisher excised that entire chapter from the book so that it could still be adopted by the schools here in Kansas. It was a very interesting result, very concrete one. And then finally, the story took me to Little Dover, Pennsylvania. Now, I'm from Pennsylvania. I grew up in Philadelphia, and Dover's about 2 hours from there, and it's really the heartland of Pennsylvania. And interestingly enough, it's a part of the state that was settled by people who were seeking religious freedom and were seeking to escape government-mandated religious beliefs in Europe. And I found it a little bit ironic that the school board was taking this particular action, which many people in the community saw as government mandating a form of religious teaching. That's not how the school board in Dover saw it, though. The majority there felt that evolution was a lie. They didn't like it. They didn't like having to teach it. They understood that the state was requiring it, and so the least they could do was to provide an alternative to their students. It's interesting, the majority was very vocal in speaking about its creationist beliefs, but that's not the platform that they were elected on. They actually ran on a platform of fiscal responsibility. And it was only after they were elected that this discussions about introducing creationist ideas into the classrooms in Dover began. And it was initially creationism, not intelligent design, that was discussed. But after consulting with attorneys and realizing that trying to teach creationism outright would not pass muster given the state of the law and Supreme Court decisions, the school board in Dover turned to this idea of intelligent design. Now, I should give you a little overview of that. It's a most beguiling notion. and it captures the imagination of all sorts of people, both religious and not so religious. It takes the position that there are certain very complex living systems, our cells, our DNA, what are sometimes called molecular machines inside living creatures that labor away unseen. And the idea is that they could never have evolved through natural processes, either because they're too complex or because they contain information, the way a book contains information. And information, such as the genetic code, is a sign of intelligence rather than of blind natural processes, or so the intelligent design advocates argue. And so the proponents of this idea, who say it's a valid scientific alternative to evolution, say they can detect scientifically, not through faith, not through religious belief, but scientifically, the very footprints of a master designer inside our cells, inside living creatures. And look, this is a cool idea. To many people, it's far more appealing than the idea, as I was saying at dinner, that we're related to our meal. You know, it's who wants to? Isn't it preferable to think of ourselves as designed by some master intelligence rather than a relative of a mollusk? If we evolved, we're just part of a very big family tree. If we were designed, then it preserves the notion that we are special. Now, this idea is not the same as biblical creationism, which basically holds that the Genesis account in the Bible is a literal history and also a science text. Intelligent design doesn't embrace that idea. It does recycle some of the basic criticisms of evolutionary theory that have been cited by creationists in the past, but it does differ in that it doesn't associate itself with any particular religion, and more importantly, it doesn't identify, at least explicitly, the designer. It says we can detect the evidence of design without naming the designers, and who knows what that might be. Maybe it's space aliens, who knows. That's actually a line from the proponents of intelligent design. It's not my characterization. We don't know who it is. Maybe space aliens. Now, from a legal point of view, this is very crafty, because if you can avoid any direct mention of the designer's identity, of any association with a particular religion, its advocates of this idea believe they can get around the Constitution's wall of separation between church and state, which I should add that the school board in Dover also, in addition to disbelieving evolution, rejects the idea that there is a constitutionally mandated separation of church and state. After instructing their kids in intelligent design, they also wanted to introduce into the classroom a book called The Myth of Separation that expounds on that theme. Now, there's more than a bit of a nod and a wink to this idea of not identifying the designer, because everyone who is attracted to intelligent design understands who we're talking about when we're talking about an intelligent designer. We're talking about God. That's why they like the idea. That's why the Thomas More Law Center in Michigan volunteered to represent for free the school board in Dover if this case, as it inevitably would, came to litigation. The Thomas More Law Center describes its practice as a ministry. Its motto is, "We are the sword and shield for people of faith." There must be a reason why they wanted to embrace this non-religious scientific idea of intelligent design. Just as there was a reason why when I went to a Christian university in Los Angeles for another intelligent design event, Biola University, the proponents of intelligent design were making their presentation and insisting that theirs was a scientific idea, not a religious one, and yet the audience of very enthusiastic supporters were shouting amen and hallelujah throughout the presentation. Now, the truth that was revealed in the course of the trial in the Kitzmiller case is that it turns out intelligent design was not conceived of by scientists with just a different point of view or new evidence. It was originally thought up by a Christian philosopher and a lawyer. and its primary textbook had been written as a creationist text with all the references to the creator cut and pasted out, and the word designer and intelligent design substituted, with no other words in the book changed. And this cut and paste change happened to a pre-publication draft of the book right after a decision by the Supreme Court called Edwards, which forbade the teaching of creation science in public schools. So before that decision, we have creationism and creation and creator in this textbook, and after the decision, we have a design and intelligent designer, where all the words creation had been. But nothing else in the book changes, except the title, which was Of Pandas and People. And this was, in fact, this book that the Dover School Board wanted to introduce to its students. This analysis of the principal textbook for intelligent design only came to light because of the lawsuit against the Dover School Board, and it was some of the more pivotal evidence that was revealed in the course of the case. So if the underlying genesis, so to speak, of intelligent design is religious in nature, does that necessarily make it unacceptable for public school teaching? No. Lots of important policies and ideas were religious in their origins. Consider the abolition movement, for instance, that led to the end of slavery. Was promoted, a policy that was promoted by primarily religious activists who did so for reasons of faith, but certainly no one would want to turn back the clock on that particular policy that won the day, finally, and thankfully. So the question wasn't just whether or not the school boards or intelligent design in general had religious elements to it. There was also a question of whether or not it was a legitimate scientific inquiry. And that's the question that probably has most rankled, or rather the answer to that question that the judge in the Kitzmiller case reached is the one that has most rankled the supporters of intelligent design, because he found that intelligent design is not a scientific idea, that it proposes at bottom, at core, a supernatural explanation for what we see in nature. And it may be correct to do so. Perhaps the intelligent design advocates are correct. This is what the judge wrote in his opinion. It's just not science. And therefore, it's not appropriate for a high school science class. It's a religious idea. Interestingly, there were members of the school board in the minority who attempted to persuade their colleagues not to introduce intelligent design and alternatives to evolution in science class, but to create a comparative religion class or a philosophy class or some other sort of venue to explore these questions and expose their students to them. But the school board majority rejected the sort of compromise. They wanted it in the science classes. And in doing that, they really revealed, it turns out, what their agenda was, which was to make this into a test case. They were, in the end, denied that opportunity because not only did they lose at trial, but they lost at the ballot box. The voters of Dover voted every one of them out of office. And so there was no appeal of this decision, and its effect does not carry weight outside the jurisdiction of the trial court. Not legally, anyway. It has already informed the decisions of a number of other communities and states who are considering a similar approach to introducing intelligent design, and they have since backed off, apparently influenced by the government's reasoning, or perhaps it was by the $1 million legal fees that the Dover School Board was liable for as a result of losing this case. Now, sadly, but perhaps predictably, Judge Jones's opinion that the teaching of intelligent design in public schools breaches the separation of church and state principle of our Constitution has not helped ease the conflicts. If anything, just the opposite. He was the judge, Judge Jones, became the target of, I suppose, you might call them the usual suspects among the punditry who practically did a war dance on TV, accused a judge who had been recommended for the bench by a conservative Senator, Rick Santorum, and appointed by the current President Bush. But once he made this decision, he became one of those dreaded liberal activist judges. He was subjected to death threats and had to be placed under 24-hour guard by U.S. Marshals shortly after the decision came out. I might also add that the subject became so controversial that a premier museum, I won't name, that was interested in Monkey Girl and having an event, said they'd like to host one but ended up not doing so because they felt it was too controversial. The National Park Service sort of weighed in an oblique sort of way in this controversy by continuing to offer for sale, even after many complaints, a creationist history of the Grand Canyon. Several presidential candidates, including Senator John McCain and your own Senator Sam Brownback, have at least at times advocated teaching intelligent design in public schools, as has President Bush. And perhaps the most interesting development for me was the role of Kirk Cameron, the former Family Matters TV sitcom teen idol, who is more recently known for his role in the apocalyptic Left Behind Christian film series. He's now a vocal, somewhat clueless critic of evolution, and he's promoting an unintentionally hilarious board game that rewards players for agreeing that evolution is disproved by the absence on Earth of animals that are half frogs and half bulls, or half dogs and half sheep. Get it? Bullfrogs? Sheepdogs? Now, why does any of this matter? Here's the problem, and we were talking about this earlier tonight. Evolution has become the Michael Dukakis of science. It's defined in the popular imagination of critics. Evolution is that silly-looking guy in the funny hat driving around in a tank letting Willie Horton out of prison. Because really, it turns out that there are two theories of evolution in America. Now, one of them I like to call the talk radio theory of evolution. And this is the one in which evolution becomes Michael Dukakis. In this version, we learn about Darwinists. By the way, evolutionary biologists never call themselves Darwinists. Only critics of evolution call them Darwinists because it sort of sounds like Marxists, I suppose, or something other equally negative. Darwinists, we're told, believe that the universe, life, and humanity all originated through some random cosmic accidents, chemicals assembling themselves into a wondrous order and complexity of nature through sheer random chance, from goo to you, as some have derided it. This is about as likely as a tornado blowing through a junkyard and assembling a 747. That's how the talk radio theory of evolution characterizes random mutation and natural selection, a tornado blowing through a junkyard. Talk radio evolution also tells us that man evolved from monkeys. And of course the old joke goes, well, if man evolved from monkeys, how come there are still monkeys? This is considered a serious argument in some quarters against evolutionary theory. It's also argued in the talk radio theory of evolution that it's never been observed, that scientists are covering up its flaws in order to disprove God, and that belief in godless evolution engenders immorality, a survival of the fittest, anything goes mentality that, among other things, inspired Adolf Hitler to launch the Holocaust. Now, who wouldn't reject such dangerous and silly nonsense? Americans are right to just say no to talk radio theory of evolution. It's a veritable scientific bogeyman, and it's hardly the stuff you'd want your children taught. Now, none of this actually matches up with the theory of evolution as scientists know it. It's all made up. It is all, again, critics defining a theory they don't like, but using misinformation to do so. Now, the truth is, and this was the subject of extensive testimony in the Kitzmiller case, the theory of evolution doesn't try to explain where life came from originally, only how, once it was here, it changes over time. It doesn't say the universe or life itself is random, just the opposite. It turns out that natural selection, the engine of evolutionary theory, is the opposite of a random process. What it does explain is the tendency of nature to preserve traits that help creatures survive and to eliminate traits that aren't helpful within a given environment. It doesn't say that we've descended from monkeys. The actual theory of evolution, the one that scientists talk about, does talk about common ancestry. It doesn't say that someday a chimp is going to give birth to a person, as Ken Hovind talked about at the megachurch I went to. That's a cartoon version of the theory of evolution. And then very interesting to me, because I wanted to know if it was true that there was a connection between Hitler and the Holocaust and Darwin's theory. And what I found is that in terms of writing that was influential on the, and it provided a justification for Hitler's final solution, it was a pamphlet called On the Jews and Their Lies. And this it's really a horrendous diatribe which advocates, here I'll read it here, persecution, concentration camps, denial of rights, and no mercy for Jews who were described as, quote, poisonous worms. Now, this pamphlet was not written by Charles Darwin. It was written in 1542 by a German monk named Martin Luther, the same Martin Luther who launched the Reformation and founded Protestant Christianity. Now, his writings were used as a justification for the Holocaust. Does that mean we should condemn Protestant Christianity as a result? Of course not. By the same token, even if it were true, and I found no evidence that it is, that something that Darwin wrote was used as a justification for the final solution, has no impact at all on the validity of evolutionary theory or Darwin's standing in the scientific community. So, if all this is true, if talk radio evolution is just a bunch of claptrap, why is it persistent? Why is that, in fact, the dominant popular view among Americans who aren't scientists and evolutionary biologists? Well, a couple things going on here. One of the things you find out if you talk to teachers is they don't like to teach evolution. They're afraid to teach evolution. They don't like to get the phone calls from parents who are angry about it. They don't like the controversy. Irony in Dover was, even before all this conflict began, evolutionary teaching was so watered down in the schools that half the kids didn't even remember learning about it. Oh, Darwin, when was he president? You know, the kids got their lessons right before summer vacation started, a week tacked on, and no discussion of human evolution, just a little discussion of Finch's and Darwin's biography, and it was over. It was hardly the stuff of hardcore evolutionary training. And really therein is the problem, because if teachers are afraid to teach it or not teaching it, or like the high school science teacher I talked to in LA who said, you know, I have five of us here teach science, and I'm the only one who actually even covers evolution in our classes. And you know it's mandated in the state of California to teach it. 4 out of 5 aren't. If that's really what's going on, well, it's no wonder that the cartoon talk radio version of evolution is preeminent, because we're teaching the real science of it poorly. We're also not teaching kids what was a major area of inquiry in the Kitzmiller case, which is the philosophy of science and the theology of science. One thing that the parents' lawyers who in the Dover case were very clever about was they brought in scientist after scientist who were also devout, Christians, believers, churchgoers, who explain that they see no conflict between their work as evolutionary biologists, or their belief in the theory of evolution, and their belief in Christian principles, in God, in as one scientist put it, I believe that evolutionary theory is one of the most important and sound scientific principles around, and I also believe that God is the author of all things seen and unseen. And those two don't contradict one another at all. So how is it that this idea that science and faith are constantly in conflict is so deeply ingrained in our culture? I think part of the reason you saw in Dover was an unwillingness to ask questions. I mean, here we have a lesson on intelligent design that we're going to bring into the classroom, and we're not going to let you ask questions about it. You have teachers who are unwilling to teach science for fear that they will be criticized. You have judges who rule in favor of science being threatened with death and requiring 24-hour protection as a result. And you have people with very large megaphones. Ann Coulter came out with a book that mentioned the Kitzmiller case and told not a single ounce of truth about it, but was very critical of the judge, very critical of scientists. And what you have is a meme that has emerged in our culture that scientists are lying to us. And there's real consequences for that. If you look at the proportions of young people who are pursuing advanced degrees in the sciences in America relative to other advanced nations, the nations we're competing with in the global marketplace, America is falling behind. We just don't make as many engineers and scientists anymore in America. We import them. And now we're not even doing that. And why is that? Well, the scientists are lying to us. Why should we be scientists? They're not honest. They're atheists. Well, you know what? There's a survey that just came out in Rice University that found that 2/3 of scientists in America believe in God. So maybe they're not atheists, but that, again, is the conventional wisdom. And this conversation, this conflict the country is having about science and faith, I want to tell you about one more case that unfolded since Monkey Girl came out. It involves a public high school teacher in Kearney, New Jersey. This is a fascinating case because it shows just how wide this conflict has become. The teacher in Kearney, New Jersey, according to one of his students who complained to a principal, was instructing his students that evolution was a lie, that the Big Bang Theory was a lie, that the Earth was 6,000 years old, that scientists were engaged in a conspiracy to deceive us, and that if the students in this public school failed to accept Jesus Christ as their personal savior, they'd all be going to hell. And this teacher actually named a particular student who happened to be Muslim as one of the kids he was absolutely certain was going to be damned. Again, this is a public school. Well, a student went to the principal and said, you got to do something about this. And the principal said, disbelieved him. There's no way. And the student reached into his pocket and says, well, here's my MP3 player. I recorded him. You may have heard this. This has been called the preacher-teacher scandal. It's been in the news. And sure enough, the recording revealed that the student was accurate in his depiction. And furthermore, it was learned this sort of thing had been going on for some time. Now let me ask you a question. Who do you believe the community vilified in this scandal, and who did it rally around? The student was vilified. He set up the teacher. And the teacher was received an outpouring of support and congratulations from the community. And the argument that was advanced in his favor was one based upon religious freedom. The notion being that it was his religious freedom that would be infringed upon if he was interfered with in these kinds of presentations in a public school. That this argument could be seriously considered by any American who has more than glanced at the Bill of Rights is not the most remarkable thing about this case. What is truly remarkable about what happened in Kearney is the school board's, I call it Orwellian solution to the problem. An action they took only after they were prodded into action by national news coverage of this controversy, and the approach they took was very much like Dover School Board's insistence that students learn about intelligent design but don't question it. So can you guess how Kearney decided to make this problem go away? They banned taping in class. Okay. So that ends my prepared remarks, and as I think I might have said, I think everybody has an opinion about this subject that's at issue in Monkey Girl. I'd like to hear them, I'd like to hear your questions, and I'll answer them as best I can.
Okay, first of all, let's thank Ed for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And